What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you what I would want from Avowed 2, because you see, I have been playing a lot of Pillars lately, a turn-based review for the original game, and I've been running through the second game recently to take another look at that one for a video as well, and those games are of course set in the same world as Avowed, if you didn't know. And that, combined with some rumors of Avowed 2 swirling around last week or so, that said, just being rumors that this is something that Obsidian was working on, and I'm not one to put a ton of stock in that, but I'd be lying if I said all of that didn't have me thinking what I would even want from an Avowed 2, and so I figured I would of course make a video about it. Now, if you have not played Avowed since release, you may well be interested in an anniversary video I made for it earlier this year, talking about all of the updates it got, because some of the things that I would definitely want in Avowed 2 were already added to Avowed post-release. These, of course, being things like all of the races being added, bonuses to each of those races, just little stuff going on like that. But before we get into that, I do want to point out that I do think Avowed 2 is more likely than Pillars 3. Personally, I would take Pillars 3 all day every day, but I love CRPGs, and so it shouldn't really be a surprise that I would prefer a more traditional CRPG experience in the vein of Pillars of Eternity. However, it's also not really news that Pillars 2 took a long time to become profitable, and that combined with Microsoft and Xbox having all sorts of money troubles these days, rumors of them shutting down studios, etc., I sincerely doubt they would be willing to take a bet on something like Pillars 3 as much as I would really enjoy it. I certainly don't have enough money to keep them afloat. So something a little more mass appealing like Avowed makes more sense, because while there were plenty of people with some legitimate criticisms we're going to get into in this video actually, it also did the important work of making the genre transition happen. And so theoretically, it should be a little easier to build from there and take into consideration some of those criticisms people had for the original game in order to make a more complete experience people would enjoy. With that said, let's go ahead and dive into this thing. Let's first talk about setting. So some small spoilers for Avowed actually going forward here, and a little bit of Pillars 2 as well, to be honest. Let's talk about where this game would even be set, because you could theoretically set it in the Living Lands again. If you're unaware, Avowed takes place in the Living Lands, and the Living Lands is a very vibrant, over-the-top place, just absolutely teeming with life and diverse biomes, etc. And so you could theoretically set another game there and actually have it be substantially different in terms of like biomes and things. However, I could see them not wanting to reuse that, and so they might want to set it someplace else. If they are going to set it anywhere else, I think it needs to be in the Adir Empire personally, that being the empire that sent you as an envoy in your role in Avowed anyway. But it's also a place the games have thus far never taken us, and so they would have a lot of room to work with there. And while I would be totally fine with that personally, it does sort of run into another problem, which is that ideally Avowed 2 would start tackling some of the bigger lore that has been introduced. So if you're up to date on the timeline, the world of Eora, the actual setting we are in, is dealing with a very tumultuous moment, let's say. At the end of Pillars 2, the cycle of reincarnation that defines the world has largely been put to a stop. And as a result, they've basically got a couple of generations to figure out a long-term solution where there's going to be a problem. Because without the cycle of reincarnation happening, people will be born without souls, which is more or less like a zombie in some ways. And then without souls churning through this cycle, the gods themselves cannot feed off of that energy, which means they would also die. And so there has to be a solution found to that problem. Avowed takes place a couple years after Pillars 2, where we're starting to see the effects of that, but it's not immediately dire. And then that game introduces a whole bunch of new lore about a natural-born god, which up to this point hadn't really been a thing. However, that natural-born god was sort of cut off and confined to the area of the Living Lands. And regardless of where I think they would set a new game, I do think they would want to hopefully address some of that stuff, and so it would come up and you'd have to sort of write your way around that. Nothing that would be impossible, but one of those would probably be ideal, but I think both would come with some hoops to jump through. But then there's the character side of things. This is pretty important to me personally, because with the big genre shift, there were some things lost in translation there. Namely, some of the class stuff that made Pillars really unique as an experience, but also, I think, a larger investment into your character as well. As I already mentioned at the top of the video, some of the post-release updates for Avowed did bring back things like all of the normal races you could play, minus the godlike, but you are a godlike already in Avowed no matter what, which is how that always worked, as technically a godlike can be of any other race, and the godlike portion is just on top of that. But either way, those races are there and playable. So the other side of this would just be that I want them to bring the classes back. And I think there's a couple ways they could do this. So the way Avowed works already is that you could effectively be a multi-class of fighter, mage, or ranger, which are, to be fair, 3 of the classes available in the Pillars games. However, there's a lot of other classes that weren't really available outside of some ability overlap, let's say. And I would really want them to bring those classes back, along with multi-classing, in fact. And I think a way they could do that is by effectively making one of these skill trees for every single class, and then simply allowing you to pick 2 of them at character creation, which would effectively be your multi-class, and then you could proceed relatively as normal from there. Now that is, of course, much easier to say than it is to do, as you would have to make all those abilities for all those classes, make them thematic, etc. And I don't think a little bit of overlap, especially in terms of like passive abilities, would be a big deal at all. Just add those passives to individual trees where they make sense. I don't think they have to be 100% unique tree to tree, but having some overlap there in terms of the active abilities and just incorporating a lot of what makes Pillars unique in particular would do a lot for, I think, both build diversity, but also getting you more attached to a character in terms of replayability. Also, this would allow them to make use of the incredible multi-class names that were added in Pillars 2. So in Pillars 2, you could multi-class, and every single possible combination of multi-class got a unique class name, which I thought was fun. And I would like to see those in Avowed 2, to be honest. But I think the real challenge of even that system, as nice as it is to say, would be incorporating some of the more difficult classes to bring into this action-oriented fold. Some of them, like I think Barbarian and Fighter, would be relatively easy. You see that in other games. Barbarian and Fighter have a lot of overlap, obvious things like that. However, the 2 most unique classes that are very like Pillars and what you think of when you think of Pillars fantasy is, of course, Cypher and Chanter. But I also think these would be difficult to incorporate into an action-oriented game, but certainly not impossible. The problem is I just don't think you could port them in wholesale no matter how much you wanted to. There's a couple reasons for that. I think Cypher in particular is a class that has interesting targeting mechanisms for a CRPG. A lot of its abilities often trigger very uniquely by either bouncing off friendly targets to hit an enemy, or going from you to a friendly target and affecting enemies in between you two, jumping from enemies, being like purely debuffs and things like that. And I could just see that being more difficult to incorporate into an action game, especially given that with those abilities, positioning is really important. And how that would feel in a more action-oriented RPG would almost certainly require some tweaking and a lot of time to get right, and I can see why they didn't want to do it for Avowed, to be honest. Chanter runs into a slightly different problem where, yes, it is a variation of a bard, let's be honest. It also functions a bit differently in the CRPGs in that chanters basically chant phrases, and those phrases individually will, of course, produce different effects. And then as they have so many phrases chanted, they basically build that up as a resource. They can then use their actual normal abilities outside of the effects produced by the chants. Meaning that a lot of what their class does is like build up those chants, and those happen sort of passively, and then your big abilities, once you've said so many phrases over a period of time, have a little more active participation, as typically what you would do is set the chants up before you get into combat. And this would be difficult to implement, I think, for a variety of different reasons. There are a ton of these chants in the CRPGs and tons of different ways to mix and match those, but they take time, in combat to actually go off. And again, I'm not really sure how well that would translate to an action game, like how well you would even be able to use those chants. It would obviously be more of like a support situation, which I think would obviously make for a good multi-class in that particular case, because then you could have more active abilities on top of the chanting. But long story short, I would really want these to be in Avowed 2. I think they're some of what makes Pillars so unique. And I think finding a way to implement them into the game in a fun way that is, of course, enjoyable is not a small thing. But if we're going to do Avowed 2, I really think that's where a lot of the effort needs to be focused, personally. And yet, it is actually not the only place a lot of the effort would need to be focused. Because next, I want to talk about the biggest criticism Avowed received, which was its static world. So, So, Avowed was never going to be a big open world sandbox. That is to say, the version we got, I know there were rumors from the initial announcement of Avowed being a thing that people really wanted it to be this sandbox to rival Skyrim, and people were very disappointed when it was not that. And I think that's for a few reasons, but I mainly think it's because a lot of people just want Obsidian to do that again. A lot of people love New Vegas, of course, and that is obviously an open world sandbox, and I think people just really want that as an experience from them again, and they just aren't receiving it. And so this game, they got close to that in the sense of it's like open world hubs and everything, was frustrating for a lot of people. And if you wanted to address feedback and criticism that Avowed received, this is pretty much the top of the list, which would be to make the game an open world sandbox with NPCs that have schedules and move around. That is, again, something that is much easier said than done, especially in an RPG where there's a lot of potential for non-linearity, but Obsidian does have that experience, and it certainly could be done. What's more, though, I think something that goes a little undersung, so to speak, was how rewarding exploration could be in Avowed. There was just stuff tucked everywhere in every little nook or cranny, and they really made it a delight to go and explore individual pieces of levels and climb on top of stuff. There was a lot of verticality, and you would usually get up somewhere, and there would pretty much always be some form of loot, even places you might think were initially unreachable. You get up there, and sure enough, there's loot to find and be collected. And I think combining that rewarding exploration with a proper open world sandbox that people want, and ideally giving us a lot of different ways to approach different quests and things, on top of the more action-oriented elements, and really kind of rope all of the RPG aspects into it, which Avowed certainly plays around with here and there, but could certainly lean into more as well. And suddenly, I think you have a game that would at the very least address the criticism this game mostly received. But to sort of start wrapping this up, if we were to get an Avowed 2, I would say that I would sincerely hope that Avowed would in fact just be a stepping stone to something bigger and better, which is something that Obsidian has done well with in the past. A lot of their sequels are in fact better than some of the original games, even speaking purely to the Pillars series, which was all in-house at Obsidian, as opposed to the sequels they worked on from other franchises. Pillars 2, for me, was a dramatic improvement over the original game, and in that sense, I would hope that Avowed 2 would be a dramatic improvement over that original that would hopefully incorporate some of this feedback and criticism that the original received. And in that sense, I do think there's a way forward, and I certainly hope there is, because otherwise I just don't know that we would get more of the world of Eora. And personally, to me, as somebody who's made a ton of lore videos and covered these games pretty extensively at this point compared to the vast majority of people out there anyway, the idea of not seeing more of this world in a medium that I love, video games of course, would be incredibly disappointing. But ultimately, time will tell what actually happens with this, and we will see if those rumors prove true. But for today, that is going to do it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.